defeat at Midway shocked Imperial Japan. Fearing an American attack on the homeland, the Japanese Navy concentrated its forces on home defense. Plans for major naval offenses were suspended. By contrast, Admiral Ernest J. King, head of the American Navy, was eager to strike at Japan and succeeded in diverting resources to the Pacific theater. King wanted to attack into the Solomon Islands. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division, commanded by Alexander Vandergrift, landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and the Florida Islands, which were on the southeastern edge of the Japanese Empire. If the islands could be held, they would then act as bases for the counteroffensive against Japan. The operation, though, was rushed and poorly planned, leading to logistical problems and bickering between commanders. The Navy then suffered a shock with the defeat at Savo Island, where Japan sank 4 heavy cruisers. Japan also landed forces at Guadalcanal while aircraft attacked the island every day. To support the Marines on Guadalcanal and deflect any major Japanese offensives, the American Navy kept 3 large aircraft carriers in the area: the Enterprise, Saratoga, and the Wasp, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Fletcher also could count on the newly opened Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, which, once aircraft arrived, would allow the Americans to control the local airspace. Fletcher was among the most decorated and experienced commanders in the American Navy. One sailor in the 1920s said of Fletcher that he was the kind of officer to say orders are orders and fight a rowboat against a 16-inch gun, trusting to his own skill to pull him through, and that skill was superb. He served both in sea assignments and in the naval bureaucracy in Washington. He was not detail-oriented and leaned on his staff and subordinates. He was not considered intelligent, but he did act quickly and prudently. However, he was humorless and could be withdrawn, leading to very few close friendships. King was Fletcher's biggest detractor. He thought Fletcher was not aggressive enough when Fletcher refused to launch an ill-advised raid on Rabaul in March 1942. King blamed Fletcher for losing the aircraft carrier Lexington, King's favorite ship. King thought the victory at Midway had more to do with the leadership of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance. Even worse, Fletcher opposed the Guadalcanal offensive, which was King's brainchild. Fletcher also feuded with Rear Admiral Richard Turner. He was one of King's protégés and oversaw the Guadalcanal landings. Both Turner and Vandergrift thought Fletcher mishandled his carriers in the early stages of the Guadalcanal offensive, and the Marines on the island felt abandoned. King was looking for any chance to remove Fletcher, who was shielded by Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet. Although Nimitz thought Fletcher could be too cautious after Coral Sea, Nimitz told Fletcher, "You have filled our hearts with pride and have maintained the highest traditions of the Navy." Nimitz also credited Fletcher with the victory at Midway. Fletcher's 2 chief subordinates were Rear Admirals Thomas Kincaid and Lee Noyes. Kincaid was level-headed, confident, and worked well with others. He rarely showed emotion, once declaring, "There isn't time to emote. There isn't time. A commanding officer may be scared. In fact, if he has any sense, he's scared. But he can't show it, not with all the men around." Noyes was an intelligence officer who ignored warnings about the attack on Pearl Harbor. Although a fine pilot and personally agreeable, Noyes was held in low regard by most of his colleagues. While Kincaid and Noyes commanded the carriers Enterprise and Wasp, Rear Admiral John S. McCain commanded at Henderson Field. Nicknamed Slew, McCain was known for being profane, sloppy, and creative. He accurately saw that Guadalcanal could draw in Japanese aircraft and act as a meat grinder to wear down the enemy. The Allied offensive in the Solomons surprised Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who commanded the Japanese combined fleet. In Japan, Yamamoto was revered as a military genius. He was certainly the Navy's most experienced, intelligent, worldly, and charismatic leader. He had fought at Tsushima, where he lost some fingers. He was a renowned gambler who openly mused that he would rather live in Monaco and play cards than reside in Japan. Yamamoto had a keen strategic mind and understood the offensive value of aircraft. However, he vehemently opposed war with America and never thought Japan could win. His Pearl Harbor attack was conceived in desperation. He aged considerably once the war started. His hair turned gray, he gained weight, and his eyes looked weary. Once considered gregarious, after Midway he became withdrawn and rarely left his flagship, the giant battleship Yamato. He was also fatalistic. To a friend he wrote, I wonder what heaven must think of the people down here on this small black speck in the universe that is Earth, for all their talk about the last few years, which are no more than a flash compared with eternity, being a time of emergency. It's really ridiculous. When asked what would happen to him after the war, he said, "I imagine I'll be packed off either to the guillotine or to St. Helena." Rear Admiral Motomi Ugaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, increasingly oversaw naval operations as Yamamoto became withdrawn. He was devoted to Yamamoto and considered to be smart and creative, but also stern. He was given to depression after his wife's death, and as the chief planner at Midway, he felt guilty over the disaster. He drank heavily and became obsessed with his own death, and was among the last to die in World War II, leading a kamikaze mission in the war's closing hours. In reaction to the Guadalcanal landing, Yamamoto and Ugaki planned a major offensive named Operation Ka-Go. The Navy would land Army and naval infantry on Guadalcanal while also destroying Henderson Field. To expedite the attack, Yamamoto called off a scheduled stopover at Truk, Japan's main base in the Central Pacific Ocean. He ordered the fleet to rush directly to Guadalcanal. However, neither he nor the Army knew how many men were on Guadalcanal. The Army believed it was spiritually superior to the Americans and could overrun them. Yamamoto shared no such delusions about spiritual superiority, but he also underestimated overall American strength in the area. The convoy destined for Guadalcanal was made up of 3 transports and included the 28th Aichiki Infantry Regiment and the 5th Yokosuka Special Naval Landing Force. They were escorted by the light cruiser Jinsu, 8 destroyers, and 4 patrol boats, led by Rear Admiral Ryujo Tanaka. Also nearby was a force of 4 heavy cruisers, commanded by Vice Admiral Ginoichi Mikawa. Both Tanaka and Mikawa were among Japan's best surface battle commanders, and ideal for their missions. The main strike force was made up of the carriers Shokaku, Zuikaku, and Ryujo, and a screening force of 1 heavy cruiser and 8 destroyers, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. They were also supported by 2 battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 3 destroyers, commanded by Rear Admiral Hiroyuki Abe, and another group of 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 6 destroyers, and the seaplane carrier Shitose, commanded by Vice Admiral Nobutake Kondo. In addition, land-based aircraft at Rabaul would make major attacks on Guadalcanal. Nagumo had commanded Japan's carriers, from their pinnacle at the Indian Ocean raid to the disaster at Midway. He was popular with his men and gave his staff much leeway. However, he was not a great carrier tactician, and Yamamoto was looking for an excuse to remove him. Kondo was an experienced commander, known as a particularly good planner. Abe, by contrast, lacked determination and imagination. Nagumo and Yamamoto relied on deception. The fleets led by Kondo and Abe would hopefully confuse the Americans. Once Nagumo destroyed the American carriers, Tanaka would land his men while Abe and Kondo attacked American ships at Guadalcanal. However, Yamamoto had widely dispersed his forces and had invited defeat in detail. In the coming battle, the carrier forces were at near parity. Japan's carrier crews were still the best in the world, and Japanese attack operations were more efficient. However, American crews had gained valuable experience and confidence after months of raiding and the victories at Coral Sea and Midway. More importantly, Americans were learning how to defend their carriers. Anti-aircraft batteries and fighters were more numerous. New radar sets made it possible to detect an attack before it came. Also, the new TBF Avenger torpedo plane was being introduced. It was a first-class airplane that would serve the Navy well into the 1960s. On August 19, 1942, Japanese destroyers shelled Guadalcanal, and many felt Fletcher was not doing enough. Even Nimitz was becoming increasingly critical. 2 days later, Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal were nearly annihilated, with the fighting intensifying. Fletcher positioned his force east of Millett, and almost exactly in Nagumo's path, but a faulty intelligence summary for August 23rd placed the Japanese carriers at Truk. Thinking the fleet was not under direct threat, Fletcher sent Noyes south to refuel. Meanwhile, Marine aircraft arrived at Henderson Field just in time to take part in the battle. Fletcher had no idea if the carriers were nearby, but Nagumo was certain when one of his scouts was shot down on August 22nd. The next day, Tanaka's force was spotted. Fletcher, after some waiting, launched a strike with aid from Henderson Field, but Tanaka had changed course and the Americans found nothing. However, Tanaka's landing on Guadalcanal was delayed. On August 24th, Yamamoto learned that bad weather at Rabaul had prevented a strike against Henderson Field. In reaction, he ordered Nagumo to send the small carrier Ryujo to strike at Henderson Field and clear the way for Tanaka's convoy, which would arrive on August 25th. Nagumo entrusted Ryujo to Rear Admiral Chiuchi Hara, one of Japan's best carrier commanders. Hara was nicknamed King Kong due to his size. Ryujo was spotted, as were Mikawa and Kondo's fleets. Fletcher hesitated to order a strike against Ryujo. He suspected that Nagumo's carriers had to be nearby, but none of Fletcher's scouts had found them. Meanwhile, Ryujo launched a strike on Henderson Field with 21 aircraft. In the fighting, they lost 6 planes, and the Americans lost 3. In response, Fletcher ordered a strike on the Ryujo with 38 aircraft from Saratoga, keeping most of his aircraft in reserve. Shortly after Fletcher ordered the strike, Fletcher's scouts also found Nagumo's carriers. Fletcher's scouts could not send the report, but they did attack, causing minor damage to the Shokaku. Meanwhile, one of Nagumo's scouts found the American carriers. Nagumo launched 2 waves of aircraft, while Abe's force surged ahead, hoping to engage the Americans in a night battle. The Japanese were superior in night fighting tactics and had more surface warships. If Abe caught Fletcher, it would likely be a disaster. Meanwhile, nerves were frayed in Chiuchi Hara's fleet. Tameichi Hara, commander of the destroyer Amatsukaze, became worried. In his words, he doubted if Ryujo would survive its first acid test in the war. When American scouts were spotted, Hara wrote, "I groaned. We went ahead according to schedule for 4 uneasy hours without sight of any more enemy planes. The sea was extremely calm, the sun shone intermittently through thick clouds. The weather, favorable for attacking aircraft, recalled memories of Midway. What a bad day." Ryujo did not at first launch its fighters for protection, to which Hara recalled, "All was so quiet and serene on board the carrier that I thought the skipper must be asleep." The fighters finally went up, but they were overwhelmed. Commander Harry D. Felt, who led the attack, said it was carried out just like a training exercise. Amatsukaze dodged the bombers, its frantic zigzags creating bow waves that drenched everyone on the bridge. The Ryujo was not so lucky. It was hit with 4 bombs and 1 torpedo. Hara said, "It was a pathetic sight. Ryujo, no longer resembling a ship, was a huge stove, full of holes which belched eerie red flames." The fires were put out, but the engines and boilers flooded. The ship quickly lost speed. The order was given to abandon ship, and Amatsukaze came in and picked up survivors, which they did even as B-17 bombers attacked. Captain Tadayo Kato, the skipper of Ryujo, was the last man off the ship. Soon after he left, Ryujo capsized and sank. Kato said, "Commander Hara, I do not know how to thank you. Please accept my humble thanks on behalf of my men." After exchanging more words, Kato wept as he thought of the men who had died. While Ryujo was sinking, Nagumo's aircraft found Fletcher's carriers. However, Fletcher had ensured that the fleet was guarded by a large patrol of aircraft. After receiving a warning through radar, Fletcher also sent out his strike aircraft with the bombers being told to head north and find the Japanese. With the decks cleared, the carriers could better survive an attack. When Wildcat pilot Charles E. Brewer saw the Japanese strike coming in, he radioed, "Okay, let's go give them hell." The battleship North Carolina's anti-aircraft fire was so furious the ship looked like it was burning. The battleship South Dakota, said one witness, was lit up like a Christmas tree. On the cruiser USS Atlanta, the ship's dog went out on deck and barked at the vessel's anti-aircraft guns filling the sky. So many anti-aircraft shells fell to the sea that it looked like it was a rainstorm. The Americans even shot down 4 of their own fighters, in addition to many of the attackers. Ensign Fred Mears watched one D-3A Val dive bomber flutter down like a butterfly and kiss the water. North Carolina managed to avoid the bombs, but Enterprise took 3 hits. Damage control managed to stop the fires, but the ship was heavily damaged. The ship might have been sunk, but Nagumo's second wave failed to find the Americans. Fletcher's own rush strike also failed to find the Japanese carriers, but 2 SBD Dauntless dive bombers spotted Kondo's force and attacked, severely damaging the seaplane tender Chitose. The Japanese lost 25 aircraft from the strike, along with most of their crews, while the Americans lost 6 fighters, most of whose pilots were rescued. Meanwhile, Enterprise suffered from flooding, which shorted out a steering motor and jammed the rudder at 20 degrees starboard. Enterprise could not maneuver or even be towed for many hours. As night fell, Fletcher received a message from Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley. He was one of Franklin Roosevelt's favorites and was tasked with overseeing the American effort against Guadalcanal. Gormley reminded Fletcher of Japan's superiority in night fighting. In reaction, Fletcher decided to head south to avoid a surface battle. He would join up with Noyes, who was streaming north. At midnight, Kondo, running low on fuel, gave up on chasing Fletcher and reversed course, joining the Japanese carriers well north of the Solomons. Nagumo was low on fuel and, having lost many aircraft, withdrew. He also believed he had destroyed the American carriers, a sentiment shared by Yamamoto and Ugaki, who rationalized that Ryujo had made a splendid decoy. Throughout the war, the Japanese in particular were known for overestimating their success, but in August 1942, all 3 admirals likely wanted to think they had avenged Midway. However, by withdrawing, they ensured Fletcher and Noyes would not catch their carriers. Noyes even launched a strike on August 25th, but his attack group found nothing. Tanaka, thinking Henderson Field was out of action, pressed on to Guadalcanal. On the morning of August 25th, 18 aircraft from Henderson Field struck. Jinsu was heavily damaged and Tanaka was knocked unconscious. The troop transport Kinryu Maru was also damaged, and the destroyer Mutsuki pulled alongside to rescue her crew and passengers, only to be hit with a bomb from a B-17. As the destroyer sank, the crew fired a torpedo that finished off the Kinryu Maru. Once Tanaka regained consciousness, he withdrew his force. With that, the battle was over. The Eastern Solomons was a significant victory for the American military. The Japanese lost more ships, aircraft, and air crews, and Japanese troop reinforcements for Guadalcanal were delayed. The aircrew losses were particularly bad considering no American carriers were sunk. Nagumo's last best chance to redeem himself had slipped away, and Japan never again had such good luck in a carrier battle. After the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands in October, Nagumo was removed. As for the American carrier force, a number of reforms were made to carrier tactics and communications. Although Japan's carrier doctrine was still generally superior, the Americans were fast closing the gap. While American aircraft losses were light, Enterprise, the elite carrier of the fleet, was out of action for 2 months. While en route to Hawaii for repairs, the ship had to bury its dead at sea. Fred Mears described the dead as blackened but not burned or withered, and they looked like iron statues of men. Their limbs smooth and whole, their heads rounded with no hair. With much of the crew busy, only one body was dipped below with full honors. The rest were placed in sacks and dropped off the stern without a ceremony. After the battle, Fletcher told his staff, "Boys, I'm going to get 2 dispatches tonight, one from Admiral Nimitz telling me what a wonderful job we did, and one from King saying, why in the hell didn't you use your destroyers to make torpedo attacks? And they'll both be right." Fletcher was correct. Nimitz considered the battle a major victory, later surmising that it gave us several weeks of valuable time to consolidate our positions there. By contrast, King thought Fletcher was a coward for withdrawing. Fletcher was exhausted, having lost weight and aged considerably in his 8 months of nearly continuous active service. Fletcher was injured when Saratoga was hit by a torpedo from the submarine I-26 on August 31st. With Saratoga out of action, Fletcher was recalled to Hawaii. McCain told Nimitz, 2 or 3 of these fights are enough for any one man. A rest will do him good. Nimitz wanted Fletcher in command after he rested, but King kept him out. He even refused to meet with Fletcher when he was in Washington, D.C. By 1949, King had even forgotten his first name, calling him Edward, and declaring that Fletcher had not very much in the way of brains. Although Fletcher capably commanded naval forces in the North Pacific from 1943 to 1945, he never again led a fleet into battle, and he received little credit after the war was over. It was now obvious that Japan could not deliver supplies with slow-moving transports because of the aircraft operating at Henderson Field. Supplies would be delivered by high-speed warships. They also had to travel at night, a point made clear on August 28th when the Japanese destroyer Asagiri was attacked by aircraft and destroyed during a daylight run. Because the runs had to be fast, the Japanese could not land heavy artillery, ammunition, and other supplies. In time, Guadalcanal became known among the Japanese as Starvation Island. On Guadalcanal, more Japanese soldiers would die of hunger and disease than combat. The victory at the Eastern Solomons ended Japan's best chance to retake the island. While the Japanese inflicted heavy losses on the Americans, Japanese aircraft and ship losses were irreplaceable. Guadalcanal was the meat grinder that broke the Japanese Navy.